2 hours after I gave birth, I looked at my husband and whispered, "Would you like to hold your daughter?" He didn't move. He stared at the tiny baby in my arms as though she belonged to someone else. Then he leaned close enough that only I could hear him. "I already have a son with another woman. I'm not putting my name on this baby." For a moment, the entire room seemed to stop breathing. The nurses continued moving around us, unaware that my marriage had just ended in a single sentence. I looked down at my daughter. She was peaceful, warm, and completely innocent. She had no idea that the first person meant to protect her had already rejected her. Instead of crying, I smiled. "Remember this moment," I said quietly. "It's the last one you'll ever have with us." He laughed. He actually laughed, convinced I was just another emotional woman overwhelmed after childbirth. He walked out believing I'd forgive him. He couldn't have been more wrong. My name is Sable Reed, and this is the story of how my husband sacrificed his wife, his daughter, and ultimately his own future, all within 2 hours of becoming a father. 4 years earlier, life looked completely different. I worked as a contracts auditor for a respected firm in Charlotte. My days were spent buried in paperwork, reviewing endless agreements while surviving on coffee that usually went cold before lunch. That's where I met Weston Calloway. He was the heir to one of the largest real estate companies in the region. Despite his wealth, he seemed surprisingly humble. He listened when people spoke, remembered little details, and treated everyone with quiet respect. At least, that's what I believed. Our relationship moved naturally. Weston never tried to impress me with expensive gifts or flashy displays. Instead, he offered consistency. He showed up when he promised. He made me laugh after difficult days. He convinced me I had finally found someone genuine. His mother, Adele, was always polite, but never warm. Every compliment felt rehearsed. Every smile felt temporary. His father, Preston, barely acknowledged my existence. Whenever I visited their home, he usually disappeared within minutes, claiming business calls or meetings that couldn't wait. I assumed that was simply his personality. Years later, I realized silence was how the Calloway family controlled every uncomfortable truth. Weston proposed 18 months after we met. He insisted on a small courthouse wedding instead of a lavish ceremony. "I only care about marrying you," he told me. Standing beside him that day, straightening his tie while his hands shook with nervous excitement, I believed every word. Looking back now, I understand that people can perform sincerity just as convincingly as they perform love. The first warning signs appeared during our second year of marriage. Weston's executive assistant was a woman named Camille Rousseau. She was intelligent, composed, and almost impossible to read. We met several times at company events, but one holiday party stayed with me long afterward. Across the room, I noticed Camille watching Weston. It wasn't affection. It wasn't guilt. It looked more like someone carrying a secret that had become exhausting. I dismissed the feeling. After all, Weston still came home every night. He remembered birthdays and anniversaries. He kissed me goodbye every morning. Surely I was imagining things. But the small changes slowly accumulated. Business trips lasted longer. Phone calls were taken outside instead of inside the house. Simple questions suddenly required long explanations. One morning, I discovered a restaurant receipt in his jacket from a town he claimed he hadn't visited. When I casually asked about it, his answer changed 3 different times before breakfast ended. Even then, something inside me knew. Truth doesn't usually require rehearsing. Still, I let it go. Because trusting your husband feels easier than admitting you may already be losing him. Around the same time, Weston and I began trying for a baby. What we expected to take months stretched into years. Fertility clinics became part of our routine. Blood tests, appointments, procedures, disappointment. Weston attended every visit during the first year. He squeezed my hand whenever another attempt failed. "We have time," he'd reassure me. "It'll happen." Those words became the hope I carried through every setback. Only later did I wonder whether he already knew his future wasn't entirely tied to mine. While I was tracking ovulation calendars and crying quietly after failed treatments, another life was already beginning somewhere I couldn't see. When I finally became pregnant during our 3rd year of marriage, Weston seemed overwhelmed with happiness. He cried during the ultrasound. He painted the nursery himself. He spent weeks helping choose our daughter's name. Watching him carefully decorate the room, I believed I was seeing a devoted father preparing for the happiest chapter of our lives. What I didn't know was that another nursery already existed. Camille was pregnant too, and by the time I reached my final trimester, she had already given birth to Weston's son. Neither I nor anyone outside a handful of people knew the truth. Weston somehow managed to live 2 completely different lives, one with me, one with her. His parents knew, his assistant knew, only I remained in the dark. As my due date approached, Pressure inside the Calloway family quietly intensified. The company's board meeting was only days away. Weston's father demanded he resolve the situation before rumors reached investors. He couldn't continue hiding both families forever. Something had to give. Unfortunately, he decided it would be us. The morning my contractions started, Weston rushed to the hospital almost immediately. He stayed beside me through 11 exhausting hours of labor. He held my hand. He encouraged me through every contraction. He even told the nurses how excited he was to become a father. Today I realize he wasn't acting for me. He was acting for himself. He wanted one final performance before everything collapsed. Our daughter Marlo entered the world just after sunrise. The moment I heard her cry, every struggle of the previous years suddenly felt worthwhile. I held her against my chest and searched for Weston. I expected tears, joy, relief. Instead, he stepped backward toward the window. His face had changed. The warmth I'd known for 4 years disappeared completely. I quietly asked, "Would you like to hold her?" He stared at our daughter. Then he answered with one word, "No." A chill spread through the room. Minutes later, he stepped into the hallway to answer his phone. Through the partially open door, I heard only fragments. A woman's voice, Weston speaking in low, tense whispers. "Not now, please, not over the phone." When he returned, he wasn't the same man who had walked into the delivery room hours earlier. He had changed into a fresh suit. His expression had hardened. Only then did I realize whatever conversation was about to happen had already been decided long before our daughter was born. Weston closed the hospital room door behind him and stood in silence for several seconds. The air suddenly felt heavier than it had during 11 hours of labor. "I need to tell you something," he said. I looked at Marlo sleeping peacefully against my chest. "What is it?" He inhaled slowly before speaking. "My assistant, Camille. We've been together for over a year." The words landed like ice. Before I could respond, he continued. "She gave birth 4 months ago." I stared at him, unable to process what I was hearing. "I have a son." Everything inside me froze. "My parents already know about him," Weston continued. "They've accepted him." I searched his face, hoping to find regret, guilt, anything that suggested this was a nightmare. Instead, he looked strangely calm. "My family needs a male heir," he said. "Camille gave them one." He glanced briefly toward our daughter. "I'm not putting the Calloway name on her." The room became impossibly quiet. I looked down at Marlo. She stretched her tiny fingers in her sleep, completely unaware that her father had rejected her before he had ever held her. "So," I whispered, "you're choosing them." Weston nodded without hesitation. "I'm choosing my family's future. Not us, not his daughter, his future." For several long seconds, I said nothing. Then I smiled. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't forgiveness. It was the smile of someone who had just accepted a painful truth. "Remember this moment," I told him softly, "because it's the last one you'll ever have with us." He laughed. "You'll calm down," he replied confidently. "We'll work something out." He honestly believed I had nowhere else to go. He picked up his phone as it vibrated again. "I have another call." Without another glance toward his newborn daughter, he walked out of the room. The door clicked shut. That was the last time I saw him as my husband. I remained in the hospital for 2 more days while recovering from childbirth. Weston never returned. Not once. No flowers, no apology, no visit, only silence. Late that first night, I called my older sister Odette. She answered before the second ring. "Sable?" The moment she heard my voice, she knew something was wrong. 4 hours later, she arrived at the hospital wearing yesterday's clothes and carrying nothing except determination. She never asked whether I was okay. Instead, she asked, "What do you need?" Then she took over. She held Marlo while I slept. She spoke with the nurses. She made sure I ate. She stayed beside me every minute she was allowed. Watching her rock my daughter to sleep, I finally admitted something I'd refused to believe for years. Weston had never been the man I thought he was. Odette gently reminded me of something she'd once said at my wedding. "Some people are only kind when someone is watching." At the time, I'd laughed. Now those words echoed through my mind with painful clarity. During my second night in the hospital, another phone call changed everything. For weeks, I had ignored repeated calls from my late Uncle Elliot's attorney, Josephine Nader. I assumed it was routine paperwork connected to his estate. Instead, she told me something extraordinary. Before his death, Uncle Elliot had asked her to review documents connected to an old business partnership involving Calloway Holdings. Buried inside those files remained an active shareholder agreement that no one had dissolved. Elliot still owned an 11% interest connected to one of the company's development divisions. Under the terms of his estate, those rights now belonged to me. "I don't fully understand what this means," I admitted. Josephine paused. "It means your husband believes you have no influence." He couldn't be more mistaken. For the first time since Weston walked away, I felt something unfamiliar. Hope. Not hope for my marriage. That was already over. Hope that I wasn't nearly as powerless as he believed. After leaving the hospital, I returned briefly to the house Weston and I had shared. Everything looked exactly the same. The nursery, the furniture, the freshly painted walls Weston had decorated himself. It all felt like a stage after the actors had gone home. Weston never came back. Instead, he stayed with his parents. The only message I received from him was a short text. "We should discuss everything calmly." I stared at those words for several minutes. Calmly? He had abandoned his newborn daughter. There was nothing calm left to discuss. A few days later, he called. His first question wasn't about Marlo. It wasn't about my recovery. Instead, he asked whether I'd spoken with anyone connected to the company. His concern wasn't his family, it was his reputation. I answered honestly. I haven't decided anything yet. That was enough to satisfy him. He ended the call believing he still controlled the situation. He didn't realize everything had already begun shifting beneath his feet. With Odette's help, I quietly packed our belongings. Every folded baby blanket reminded me of promises Weston had made while painting the nursery. Every tiny outfit reminded me of the future he'd chosen to abandon. By the end of the week, Marlo and I moved into a small rental home only a few streets away from my sister. It wasn't luxurious, it wasn't grand, but it was peaceful. More importantly, it was ours. The following Monday, I met Josephine at her office. For hours, we reviewed every document Uncle Elliot had left behind. Only then did I fully understand the opportunity sitting in front of me. The shares wouldn't hand me control of Callaway Holding, but they did provide something far more valuable. They allowed me to request an official review whenever executive behavior threatened the company's financial stability or public reputation. Callaway Holdings happened to be negotiating major financing at that exact moment. A hidden affair, a child with an employee, false statements made to lenders. Those weren't simply personal problems, they were corporate risks. Josephine closed the folder and looked directly at me. "You don't need revenge," she said. "You only need the truth." For the first time since giving birth, I smiled, and this time, it was real. The official review request was filed at the beginning of the following week. I didn't announce it. I didn't threaten anyone. I simply allowed the company's own rules to begin doing exactly what they were designed to do. Within days, senior board members were notified that concerns had been raised regarding executive conduct during an active refinancing period. Suddenly, the truth Weston had hidden so carefully was no longer just a family secret. It had become a business issue. While everything unfolded behind closed doors, I focused on something much more important: learning how to be Marlo's mother. My days became wonderfully ordinary, feeding her, rocking her to sleep, walking the floor at 3 in the morning, while she cried for reasons only babies understand. Every smile she gave me reminded me that despite everything, I had something Weston would never fully appreciate: her trust. About 2 weeks after the review request was submitted, my phone rang unexpectedly. The caller ID displayed Camille Rousseau. For several seconds, I simply stared at the screen. Finally, I answered. Her voice sounded exhausted, not defensive, not angry, just tired. "I thought you deserved to hear everything from me before the board does," she said quietly. I listened without interrupting. She explained that she had moved to Charlotte alone for the opportunity to work at Callaway Holdings. Without family nearby, she had thrown herself into work. Weston had been kind, attentive, always available whenever she struggled. Slowly, professional conversations became personal ones. Late-night emails turned into late-night dinners. Eventually, promises followed. "He told me your marriage was already over," she admitted. "He said he was only waiting for the right time." I closed my eyes. The story sounded painfully familiar. "He promised he'd leave you." Camille's voice cracked. I believed him. Then she told me she'd discovered she was pregnant. By then she felt trapped. She had no family nearby, very few friends, and the father of her child kept assuring her everything would work out. "I wasn't trying to steal your life," she whispered. I honestly believed he was already leaving it. There was a long silence. Finally, I asked the only question that mattered. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because someone deserves the complete truth," she answered. Neither of us did anything to deserve being lied to. After we ended the call, I sat quietly for a long time. I realized Weston hadn't destroyed one woman's life. He had manipulated two. Camille and I had simply been standing on opposite sides of the same illusion. The board meeting arrived on a rainy Thursday morning. Josephine assured me I wasn't required to attend. I went anyway. Marlo slept peacefully inside a baby carrier against my chest as I entered the Callaway headquarters. Employees glanced toward me before quickly looking away. Rumors had already begun spreading. The conference room felt colder than the weather outside. Several board members sat around the long table. Outside, legal counsel occupied one end. Preston Calloway entered last. He looked older than I remembered. When everyone had settled into their seats, he turned toward Weston. His voice remained calm. "Is it true," Preston asked, "that you fathered a child with an employee while assuring our lenders your personal circumstances presented no risk to the company?" Weston adjusted his tie. "This is a private family matter." "No," Preston replied firmly. "It stopped being private when it became a corporate liability." Silence filled the room. For the first time since I had known him, Weston looked genuinely uncomfortable. He tried explaining that everything had been under control, that both situations were being handled responsibly. One board member interrupted. "Did responsibly include refusing to acknowledge your newborn daughter at the hospital?" Weston couldn't answer. The room remained silent. Then Josephine calmly introduced additional evidence. A former executive had recently shared months of text messages exchanged with Weston. Messages that painted a very different picture. In one conversation, Weston joked that after publicly recognizing his son, he intended to quietly distance himself from Camille once the attention disappeared. She had never been part of his long-term plans. Neither had I. He had been using both of us. Camille lowered her eyes as the messages were read aloud. When they finished, she stood slowly. She looked directly at Weston for what felt like the first time all morning. "You should have told the truth," she said quietly. "To anyone." Then she walked out of the room. No shouting, no tears, just disappointment. I watched Weston carefully. The confidence that had defined him for years had completely disappeared. For once, there was no clever explanation waiting to save him, only consequences. When the meeting finally ended, I carried Marlowe toward the elevators. Before the doors closed, Weston caught up with me. "You planned this," he said. I looked at him calmly. "No. I simply stopped protecting your lies." The elevator doors slid shut between us. For the first time since our wedding day, I walked away without looking back. The months that followed weren't dramatic. They were exhausting. Lawyers exchanged documents. Financial records were reviewed. Depositions stretched for hours. Nothing happened overnight, and no miracle suddenly erased the damage Weston had caused. The inheritance issue proved far more complicated than anyone expected. Josephine explained that decades-old trust language gave Marlowe a strong legal position because she had been born during a lawful marriage. Camille's son, despite being innocent in every way, didn't qualify under those same succession rules. Neither child had created the conflict. Weston had. After months of negotiations, the dispute finally ended without a courtroom trial. Marlowe would remain the only child formally recognized within the family's succession structure. Whatever arrangements Weston chose to make for his son would have to come from his own personal assets, not from the company's inheritance. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The daughter he had refused to hold became the only child the Calloway family was legally obligated to protect. The divorce was finalized soon afterward. I didn't ask for revenge. I asked for fairness. Thanks to Uncle Elliot's shares, the board's findings, and the settlement negotiations, fairness turned out to be far more valuable than Weston had ever imagined. When custody discussions began, I made one decision I have never regretted. I didn't try to keep Marlowe away from her father. If Weston truly wanted to become the man he should have been, I wanted my daughter to have that opportunity. The court established a reasonable visitation schedule. At first, Weston seemed determined to make it work. He attended several visits. He brought gifts. He smiled for photographs. But old habits rarely disappear. Soon he started arriving late. Then he canceled appointments because of work. Eventually, entire weeks passed without a phone call. By Marlowe's first birthday, he had quietly stopped trying. No judge could force someone to become a father. That decision had always belonged to him. Nearly a year later, Preston contacted me through Josephine. He asked whether we could meet somewhere neutral. We chose a small coffee shop near my new home. He looked older than I remembered. Not physically, emotionally. For the first time since I had known him, the powerful businessman sitting across from me looked like a man carrying genuine regret. "My father raised me to believe usefulness mattered more than love," he admitted. I taught the same lesson to Weston without realizing it. He stared into his untouched coffee. "When I watched him walk away from your hospital room, I realized I wasn't watching my son. I was watching myself." It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was honest. Sometimes honesty arrives too late to repair the past. Still, it matters. Adele sent me a carefully written letter a few weeks later. She explained that family situations were often complicated and hoped I could eventually understand everything that had happened. I read every word. Then I folded the letter and placed it back into the envelope. I never replied. Some wounds don't heal because someone finally decides to explain them. Marlowe and I eventually moved into a quiet home with a large backyard. It wasn't the mansion I once imagined raising a family in. It was better. It was peaceful. Odette visited almost every weekend. She spoiled Marlowe endlessly and never missed an opportunity to remind me she'd never trusted Weston's perfect manners. Josephine remained part of our lives too, handling the trust paperwork with her usual dry humor. Every time we met, she joked that Uncle Elliot probably knew exactly what he was doing long before anyone else did. Preston began sending birthday cards addressed simply to my granddaughter. Over time, he asked whether he could occasionally visit. I agreed, not because of his last name, not because of his money, because one day Marlowe deserves the chance to decide for herself what kind of relationship she wants with every member of her family. Almost a year after everything ended, my phone rang late one evening. Weston's name appeared on the screen. I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered. His voice sounded nothing like the confident executive I had married. It sounded defeated. "I've made a lot of mistakes," he admitted. "I know that. I was wondering," he hesitated, "is there still any way I can be part of Marlowe's life?" For several seconds, I said nothing. Then I remembered the hospital room, the empty chair beside my bed, the daughter he wouldn't hold, the promises he chose to abandon. "Finally," I answered. "You had 2 hours." He remained silent. "I gave you every day after that to make a different choice. You never did." When I ended the call, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. I was simply finished. He never called again. No letters, no messages, no unexpected visits, just silence. Today, Marlowe is growing into the happiest little girl I know. She runs everywhere. She laughs without hesitation. She asks endless questions about the world around her. Sometimes she asks about her father. She's still too young to understand the whole truth, so I simply tell her he's far away. One day she'll be old enough to hear the complete story. When that day comes, I won't teach her to hate him. I'll teach her something far more valuable, that another person's rejection never determines her worth. Sometimes I still think back to that hospital room, not because of the betrayal, not because of the pain, but because of the moment I chose to smile instead of breaking apart. That single decision changed the rest of my life. Maybe my strength came from Uncle Elliot quietly protecting my future without ever telling me. Maybe it came from Odette refusing to let me face those first nights alone. Or maybe it came from finally realizing that I deserved to be chosen by the people who truly loved me. Every night before Marlowe falls asleep, I tell her the same thing. The people who are supposed to choose you sometimes don't. And that's not where your story ends. It's where you discover who truly will. Most nights, she's already asleep before I finish. I whisper those words anyway, not only for her, but for myself. Because after everything that happened, they're still the truest words I know. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't revenge. Sometimes it's building a life so full of love that the people who walked away become nothing more than a chapter you survived. If you had been lying in that hospital bed, watching everything you believed collapse in a matter of minutes, would you have smiled the way I did? Or would you have let him see every ounce of your pain? Tell me in the comments, because even now, I still wonder which one of us truly walked away with everything.